everybody, and welcome back to KSP 101. Today is episode 7. It's a very big episode for numerous reasons. Uh, as you may already know, today is February 14th, 2020. It is Valentine's Day, so happy Valentine's Day, everybody. And today we hit 50 subscribers. It may not seem like a whole lot, but it means a lot to me, so thank you all for following me and watching these videos, and I hope they've been a great help to some, or just something fun to enjoy and come along with me on this fun little journey that we've had. But today, again, is a very big and special episode. We're going to be wrapping up the last of our activities here around the local Kerbin system by doing a lot of missions today all in one. We are going to be rendezvousing 2 vessels around Minmus, docking them up, transferring between the 2 vessels. We're going to be landing on Minmus, deploying some breaking ground science on the surface, grabbing some green sandstone and science from the surface, as well as grabbing some science from the space around Minmus. Technically, we're also going to be making a orbital station around Minmus, so we have a lot to do today. So let's get right into it. Now, in the last episode, when we last left off, I mentioned that we were going to be refitting these vessels, or the last vessel that we made, the rocket, the M2 rocket. And once we get our VAB loaded up here in just a moment, we will get to refitting the M2 rocket into the M2A. Let's go ahead and pop up here and rename this into the M2A rocket. And now, when I say that we're going to refit this, that means the rocket is going to stay the same. We're just refitting this capsule up here. Now, what we need to do is refit it one of 2 ways. One way is going to be just simply for making orbit so it can dock up to the other vessel that we're going to send. And both craft also have to be able to make it back. So to start off, it's time to use that new docking port that we just unlocked in the last episode. We'll remove that parachute at the top, and that is not the docking port. This is, here we go, the larger docking port. And we will place that at the top and auto strut it to grandparent part. And now, by eliminating that parachute, it's not going to land as slowly as it should. So let's go down here to our utility menu, grab these radial mount parachutes here, and let's go ahead and attach those, let's say, here, and we'll set it to radial 2, and we'll do the same thing over here on this side. Make sure to auto strut those to grandparent, and then what we will do is eliminate these chutes, and now it should still be able to land nice and smoothly. We're also going to have to add some RCS thrusters onto the vessel. We'll stick them down here and set them to radial 4. Looking good. Now we just need to fill our monopropellant on this capsule back up, and then add just a wee bit more monopropellant. We'll take the Stratus V roundified monopropellant tanks, which contain about 20 monopropellant each. So if we place 2 of those, that'll make it 40 on top of the 30 that we have in the capsule, totaling for about 70. And I'd say that should be enough, because one vessel that we're going to be putting in orbit will be primarily used for the docking procedure, and then the other vessel can use its RCS after it reorbits Minmus upon landing and do the docking on the second go around. Okay, so this one's looking like it should be fairly prepared, but we do need to remember, in order to fulfill that station contract, we need to put on this thing. So we'll just place those. See, we want to make sure that it won't be in the way of the solar panel here, so we'll just stick it on the back side. We'll hold the L1 and R1 buttons, or both top shoulder buttons on the Xbox, and then use the D-pad to move it down by pushing up on the D-pad. Take it as low as possible, then move it back up, and then we'll set it to radial 1. Now that should be good enough. if anything, we shouldn't lose that as long as we don't deploy it. We just have it on there so we can fulfill this contract obligation. The prerequisite to have an antenna on it. Now we won't necessarily need it on the other vessel. And I believe that should be everything that we need for this capsule for the first launch. So let's go ahead and reattach this. Just want to make absolutely certain though. I'm going to go through all these parts and make sure. Don't need any of that, or that, or that. Won't need any of that. Won't need any of this stuff. We are going to add a fairing though. Let's open up our engineer report and make sure that all these stages are still properly weighed. We'll begin by checking the top stage with the poodle. Should be no more than about 24 tons, and it's under that, so that's good. Let's reattach that, and we'll check our wolfhound stage. Should be no more than 37. It's very close, but we'll leave it as it is. Should still have plenty of delta V. And then we'll check our skipper stage here, the mid stage for the launch. So 630, or I mean 63 tons. It's pretty close. Found is awfully close as well. And the launch stage itself with the mainsail also looks like it's still good to go. Let's make sure that our aerodynamic overlay is in between our thrust and center of mass. Still looking good. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. Make sure our staging is good. Let's go up here and make sure these radial mount parachutes are set properly. Those will go off second. These will go off first. Very good. Go ahead and save again just in case. Now to add the fairing, we need to probably try to put that here. We'll get that 2.5 meter Airstream protected shell fairing, place it here, and then we'll extend it out about that far, move it up about that far. Let's see, let's move it up just a little further on the second portion of that, and then we'll take it up as high as we can and close that fairing, and we'll reattach the tank. Go into the fairing menu, and I don't know why, I just like to have only two sides on my fairings. It just looks better whenever you eject it. We'll set the ejection force, and typically I'll put it at about 500, but this is a very simple one. Well, okay, I guess we're gonna have to put it over 500, or else it will supposedly obstruct the hatch, and it won't be able to fully deploy properly, I guess. Okay, there we go. We'll set it to clamshell. It's still saying hatch obstructed. Let's play with this until it says it's not, and then we will set the auto strut to grandparent part. We'll save again. Looking good. And in the last episode I mentioned that one vessel is going to launch with a pilot and an engineer. The other vessel is going to launch with a pilot and a scientist. That way once they dock, we can take the scientist or the engineer, whichever, from one capsule and transfer them into the other one, so we can land on Minmus with a pilot, an engineer, and a scientist. So now we need to go ahead and get our Kerbals in here. But before we do that, we also need to make sure that we have that fairing staged properly. We're going to want to make sure that it is staged to be probably around here. Say by the time we are done with our first stage launching and then second stage making it to space, we should be able to deploy the fairing and then finish off the orbital burn with the wolfhound and then make our transfer with the poodle. So let's go ahead and save our progress there. Let's get rid of Bob, and we'll make sure that Valentina is the pilot for this vessel, and we'll send Bill with her. Actually, no, let's send Bob with her. Alright, so our first launch will be with Valentina and Bob. Our second launch will be with Jebediah and Bill, where they will rendezvous, dock, and transfer up into the second vessel, and then land on Minmus. So let's save and launch. Now before we launch, I'm going to take the fairing down to the first stage and deploy it, and make sure it deploys properly, and then we'll revert to launch and actually do the launch and make our way to Minmus. And hopefully this time the moon won't get in the way, so I can show the normal way that we typically transfer to Minmus. So I'm gonna go, yeah, we need to test that fairing first, so now you can just highlight the part and deploy it that way, but I'm also gonna show another way that you can do it, which is just by dragging it down to here, and then staging, looking good. Looks like that will deploy without any problems at all. So let's go ahead and revert our flight back to launch. And time to do the real thing. But before we do, we're going to go to our map view and kind of try to set ourselves up to where we can just burn straight to Minmus as soon as we hit the correct altitude in space. So let's go to map view, and we will go ahead and set our target to Minmus. Zoom back in. Looks like we're almost where we need to be already. I hate the fact that it's a night launch because it's going to be a little harder to see. Plus, we are going to have to correct our degree of inclination anyway, so I'll just go ahead and just time warp ahead until it's daytime, and then we'll just launch, make orbit. Well, actually, that's fairly close, but we'll just do it anyways. Let's turn our SAS on, throttle up, and launch. Nice low fuel efficiency on the launch stage. And we'll just do our typical launch. We'll wait until it hits about 100 meters per second, work our way over to that 80 mark, staying on a 90 degree inclination on our plane. Then we'll move over to 90. Once we hit close to about 500 meters or so per second, we should be at that 90 marker. Alright, we are almost at 100 meters per second, so let's go ahead and slowly start turning ourselves over. Where there's not as much thrust over the weight right now, we have to move it just a little slower and try our best to keep it on that 90 degree inclination. Slowly moving it over. Our prograde hits the 90 mark, the top 90 mark, by about 175, moving over to the 80 mark by about 250. The prograde should be right over top of it, very good. So we'll just keep moving over at about this pace, all the while trying to make sure our degree of inclination down there where it says HDG is at 90 as we turn. Looks like it's going a little under, so we'll move it up a little bit to try to force the prograde marker back onto the 90 degree plane. As we work our way over to this 90 mark, time to stage. Okay, now this has even less thrust away than the launch stage, so we want to try to stay closer to the prograde mark as we make our way over to that 90 degree angle of turn on the 90 degree inclination. Looks like we are right where we need to be. Just make sure it's on that 90 inclination and lock our SAS there. Let's go to our map view. Now we are just waiting for the apoapsis to hit about 70,000, and then we will go full sideways and finish out the rest of our orbital entry burn. Now here shortly this should be switching to orbit mode on its own. Just waiting for that and for the apoapsis to hit about 70,000. Okay, so now it's set to orbit. Let's just go ahead and keep on the 90 degree angle as it climbs up to 70,000. And by the time it hits there, it should be time to stage, where the Wolfhound will be taking over, which we preferably don't want to use the Wolfhound engine until we are very close to leaving the upper atmosphere and making our way into the vacuum, because really that engine is only efficient in a vacuum. It has much less thrust in an atmosphere. Okay, so we are now at 70,000. Let's go ahead and turn sideways and lock ourselves on 90 and go ahead and stage. Get rid of that fairing. Close enough to leaving the atmosphere, it's safe enough to get rid of that fairing. If you're playing on harder difficulties, parts will burn up and explode very easily, so those fairings are very useful. But we are playing on normal, so it's not as much of a threat. Just make sure to stay on that 90 degree plane inclination and stay sideways as much as possible. It will keep burning until our apoapsis reaches about 100,000 or as close to it as we can get. As you can see, it's actually decreasing in time very slowly, so there's a chance we won't hit 100,000. At least not at first. But the more we burn and the more it circularizes, the more it's going to keep racing faster and faster and faster. So we are about a quarter of the way to our orbit. So it's going to pick up speed real quick here in about 10 seconds or so. And we'll just watch for that to hit 100,000. Should have just enough in this stage to make orbit. Okay, now it's picking up speed even faster. Let's go ahead and check our rotation as well. We're still good. We're now back to fully sideways. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Okay, let's cut the engine off. We are already in space. Let's make sure to wait until we're in space to deploy the solar panels. But we do want to make sure to deploy them before we go any further. And then we will go ahead and warp over to the apoapsis, set ourselves to prograde, and then highlight that periapsis. And once we are about 7, maybe 5 seconds away from the apoapsis, we will finish our orbital burn. We still have 445 meters of delta B remaining. Just plenty to finish off this orbit, and likely enough to make our degree of inclination correction burn. We are approaching the descending node, so we will set our vessel to lock on normal to raise that up to 0. Let's find Minmus real quick too. Looks like Minmus is behind us, so we have plenty of time to do this. Let's go ahead and warp over just a little behind the descending node because we're not sure just how much time it's going to take to level that out to 0. Once we're fairly close, like we are here, let's go ahead and start our burn to where it kind of stops the descending node dead in its tracks. Okay, it's barely moving closer to us, so we'll just leave it there just in case we run out of fuel, so we can stage and finish off the burn without passing the descending node. Once it hits about anywhere between 0.5 and 1 on the negative mark, we will cut the engines off and wait till we're real close to it. Looks like we'll be stopping at about 0.5. Let's go ahead and time warp a little bit until we're really close. Zoom in so we can get a closer look. Slow it down a little more, and cut the engines as soon as it's about to quickly wrap around, like so. Now we have a nice degree of inclination for our transfer burn. Now we just have to wait until Minmus is in the correct spot. Let's go on ahead and set ourselves to prograde, and then warp around to where Minmus is about to come over the horizon of Kerbin. And then the vessel will automatically rotate to prograde, and we should see the target marker very close. About here is where we're going to want to burn. As soon as the yellow prograde marker begins to touch that target mark, let's also make sure our vessel is rotated properly to where the panels are on the top and bottom side, so none of the parts of this vessel get in the way of those solar panels. And we will finish the rest of our warp until that prograde is starting to touch the target mark a little bit, and we will begin our transfer burn. Go back to map view. And this stage should finish off really soon, if I'm not mistaken, so let's prepare to stage. Very Minmus. And we should definitely have enough fuel to make it there, to put ourselves in orbit, and wait for Jebediah and his crewmate to make their way to Minmus as well, so we can rendezvous, dock up, complete the transfer, and then prepare to land on Minmus. For now, we wait, keeping an eye on our ascending node and our apoapsis. Once our apoapsis gets close to about 45 million or so, we should be touching the gravitational influence of Minmus. Let's go ahead and set our focus on Minmus. Zoom in a little bit in preparation. And it's going to get faster and faster as we extend our orbit. Just want to make sure to keep an eye on that. Make sure that the probe rate is still relatively close. And once we get close enough, we need to stop and then slow it down a little bit and finish the rest of our burn until we get an encounter. Should be about now. Let's take a look and see where we are. Okay, we are right on line where we should be. Very nice. Okay, let's go to our engine here and reduce the thrust limiter to about 5 or so. That should be okay. And then go back to the map view, highlight our periapsis and bring it in a little closer. We want it to be at about 50,000 or so. That's close enough. Let's go ahead and quick save. Now, is the moon going to be in our way this time? That's the question. Looks like we are clear of the moon. Alright, so let's go ahead and set our time warp forward 1. That did move it a little bit, and actually got us a little closer to 50,000. Didn't really affect it a whole lot, so it's okay. Let's go ahead and warp. Go back to our engine. Open it up so we can set our thrust limiter back. If we go back to the map view and then go back, it'll still be open, so we can do that. Now we can go back to the map view and keep an eye on our vessel. And it's reaching the apoapsis. It is now at its slowest point, and we will be increasing our speed as we fall back towards Kerbin, but along the way, Minmus has grabbed us. Now we are under the influence of Minmus's gravity. Let's highlight our periapsis, set ourselves to retro, and while the vehicle is reorienting itself, let's set our thrust limiter back to maximum at 100. Let's also check our rotation, make sure those panels are at the top and bottom, and then we will finish warping ahead to the periaps. Nice and close. It shouldn't take more than about 10 seconds to do this. That should be good. Let's go ahead and finish our warp and hit both sticks in to refocus on our vessel. Zoom in a little bit so we can keep an eye on ourselves. Once we get about 10 seconds away from that periapsis, we will begin our retro burn to bring our orbit down to a nice stable 45 by 45, preferably 50 by 50. I don't know why I like 50,000, I just do. But let's go ahead and finish warping the rest of the way forward, so we have about 10 seconds left. And 4, 3, 2, 1, burn. And once we get the orbit, we will slow down just a hair. Okay, let's highlight that apoapsis so we can keep track of it. And once it gets back down to about 5 seconds away from the periapsis, we'll reignite the engines. And once that drops down to about there, about 80,000 or so, we will make a nice slow burn to finish off this orbital burn. And at about 5 seconds, we'll increase the speed, bring it down. Now we're at 45 by 45, very good. Now we just need to see it has a strange angle that we need to correct. And where we are in our orbital trajectory, we are starting to move down, so we need to hit normal to raise it back up. And the great thing about normal, it has a little tiny dot there. It's not necessary, but it's good that it is there, so we can actually keep an eye on that as we burn back towards true north. And as soon as that hits 0, we'll cut the engines. Now we should have a nice 90-degree inclination orbit, very good. very smooth. Close, very close. We'll just warp until we're at that midpoint, and we're going to have to lower it back down from there. Just trying to make this as nice and level as possible so the rendezvous might go a little more easily. So as soon as we finish, okay, for some reason it didn't warp where it needed to be. Let's just go ahead and finish that. Once it reaches there, we'll lower our orbital inclination back down to where it needs to be. Which on this side, it won't be 0, it'll be 180 degrees. Now upon arrival, we will let the vessel reorient itself towards anti-normal and begin to burn. And once that raises up to 180, we will cut the engines off, and we should have a nice, even 90-degree inclination on our orbit. That looks much better. Okay, so let's go ahead and save. And this vessel is ready to sit back, relax, and wait on the other vessel to make its way to Minmus. We'll lock it to prograde. Actually, let's lock it on retrograde. That way it may be pointing at the other vessel in advance once it makes the rendezvous. But for now, it looks like it's ready to just chill. So let's quick save and return to our Space Center. And we're going to have to refit this vehicle again, because we are going to need to make sure it can land on Minmus nice and smoothly. Maybe put some of the new landing gear on it, and include the braking ground science modules that we're going to deploy once we land on the surface of Minmus. So let's go into our VAB. And once the VAB is finished loading here in just a few seconds, we'll go back up top, and we will remove everything from the heat shield down from the vessel, like we did last time. Let's go ahead and rename this one to M2-B. We've almost got everything we already need on the vessel. We just need to add some braking ground science. So let's go down to our cargo, grab the cargo storage unit. Now to just figure out where we're going to place this. Not really a whole lot of room to work with, huh? Let's set this here for now, and then we will grab the barometric pressure reader and move it up to about here. And then we'll move around to the other side, grab our thermometer, reset it, and put it about here. And then we're going to have to wrap back around and grab this so we can make sure it's in line with the thermometer, and then we have some room to place this. And who needs windows anyways, am I right? Okay, let's put this here and set it to radial 2. Make sure to set it to grandparent part on the auto strut, and then we will move it into the capsule so it's not popping out like that. Like so. That looks a lot better. Ooh, a little too far. Let's pop it back out just a hair. Okay, there we go. Now if we deploy these solar panels, looking good. Okay, nothing is in the way of anything. Now we can load up our science into here. Now we do have a new part. It's the, a new module. It's the weather analyzer. If I close this, we can see it better. We can extend the menu, and as you can see, it requires an atmosphere, and Minmus does not have an atmosphere, so we're not going to be taking that. But we are going to be taking the control module, as well as the goo monitor and a photovoltaic panel. And we'll hop around to the other side, and just in case, we will put another photovoltaic panel in, another goo monitor, and another control station in case we want to do a little biome hopping while we're there. so we can deploy a couple of those. That should be all the breaking ground science we need. We have our RCS, we have our standard science that we can do once we get to the surface. Looks like we have everything that we need. So let's go ahead and reattach this to the command pod. Very good. Now we just need to, again, check the engineer report to make sure that we aren't over mass on each stage. That one looks good. This one is at 37.8. That's a little more than it needs to be, but I think it'll be okay. We do need to add a secondary configuration to our launch stage. Let's go ahead and do that by grabbing these TT38K radial decouplers, and we'll put those about here and set it to radial. Let's go ahead and do radial 4. Never hurts to over-engineer a little bit. Now let's set those to grandparent part, and then we will grab the largest FL engine available, which is the FLT800, and then we will take those and attach those to these radial decouplers like so, and set those to grandparent parts. These weigh 4.5 tons, so we can put about 3 of these all together if we really want to, which we should. Let's put one on top and then one on the bottom. Looks like we'll need to raise this up a little bit, so let's go to our move tool, highlight the radial decoupler. We'll move it up to about here. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, that looks a lot better. Alright, so 3 of these should equal out to about, I want to say 14.5 tons. Which means we'll need to be able to push 14.5 tons, which should not be a problem at launch for the swivel engine. So we'll just put the swivels here, set those to root, and we will go to our aerodynamics and grab these new nose cones that point towards the vessel. For some reason I've been having issues with making sure all those point towards the vessel, but it looks like we're not having that issue now. So we'll put those there and move them to where they're all pointing towards the vessel, place them, and let's just set those to black and white so they look a little cooler. Alright, now we just need to strut those up to the central staging. Let's go to our structural menu, grab these struts, go to the top, set them here, and then we'll put these up as high as we can. Make sure they're nice and centered and place them. And we'll grab some more struts and find the central area there. Let's zoom in on the tank so we can get a better view. And we'll strut that about there. Then we need to go down to the bottom. Make sure we do the same thing to the bottom of the tanks. Find the center, zoom in, and make sure it's centered on the central stage. Set those there. Then we just need to strut these tanks together. Just like we did at the bottom of the tanks, we'll do it on the sides at the bottom. And we'll raise ourselves up and strut them up top. Now, that should be enough strutting to make it nice and stable for launch. We just need to now make sure, well, let's go ahead and put one more around the center. We'll put it about here. Strut those to the other tank here. That should definitely be enough struts. Let's go to our fuel tanks and grab these fuel lines and make sure that all these outer tanks are set to dump fuel to the center stage. That way, once they run out and we decouple those outer stages in a core lift cross configuration, the central stage will still be at a full tank. And then we just need to make sure our aerodynamic overlay is still looking good. It's probably not. Actually, for some reason, it's much lower. And if I had to guess, it's because of those nose cones. So let's take those fins and we will raise them up to where the aerodynamic point is in between the center of mass and the thrust. Looking good. Alright, now is there anything else that we are going to need to do with this vessel? I don't believe so. We may need to add some landing gear. Let's go back to radial 1, drop that tank off to where we are just focusing on this top stage, and go to our landing gear. We should have, okay, we do not have the new landing legs. We still have the mid-size. So let's place these as low as possible on this bottom tank and then set it to radial 4. Then we will make sure it's deployed shielded and retract those. And then we will put this back on. Looking good. Now we should be solid and ready for launch. We just need to make sure to go back to our structural parts, go down here, and grab the stability enhancers for the launch. And then place those on these outer tanks, as close to the center of mass as possible, centered on those tanks, like so. Very good. Alright, now we need to check our staging. We're going to want these 4 outer engines to ignite. After the 4 decouplers for the launch engage, and make sure the central tank goes off before those engage. Then we want those 4 decouplers to deploy and get rid of those 4 outer boosters, leaving the central stage to continue. And then the rest of it looks fine. We just need to separate fairing from that stage and make sure it's in a proper place. This is the Wolfhound stage. We'll take this, make sure it deploys before the Wolfhound stage to help reduce the mass and gain a little bit more delta V on the Wolfhound stage. Otherwise, it is looking good. So let's save our craft, save all of our progress there. I believe we're okay. So let's go and make sure that we have the Kerbals in the vessel. Save one more time, and then we will launch. Now, just to review what we're about to do, now that we have the other vessel in orbit of Minmus at a nice 90-degree inclination, we're going to launch this vessel, make a rendezvous with that other vessel, and we're going to dock them up together, and we're going to transfer the other Kerbal, not sure if it was our scientist or our engineer, but whichever it was, we're going to transfer them into this vessel, land on Minmus, deploy the breaking ground signs, finish up all the other science-based contracts on the surface, and then on our way back, make sure to grab any other signs that we may need. Let's go ahead and look at it and make absolutely certain we know what we're doing. We need signs from the space around Minmus. We need to land on Minmus, return to Kerbin from the surface of Minmus, plant a flag while we're there, and make sure to grab all the signs from the surface to bring back and deploy the breaking ground signs modules to get that. And definitely need to make sure to try to grab a green sandstone while we're there. Alright, so let's get underway. Let's get rid of that. Let's just open up our resource menu, and then we will time warp to the day side. There we go. Alright, and then we will close our warp menu, set our SAS, throttle up, and launch. Very nice. Very stable. We are on our way. Looks like we should have plenty of time to finish this within the hour. This will likely be the last launch for any mission around the Kerbin system for now. After all this is said and done, we should be preparing to leave the Kerbin system and head to our first extraplanetary body, which should be Duna, but we'll find out at the conclusion of this episode. For now, it is time to start turning towards that 80-degree marker. We are moving a little faster, and we are under that 90-degree inclination, so let's raise it up a little bit and move over just a tad bit faster than we have been. Want to make sure that prograde is right over top that 90 mark at about 175, 185. Let's go ahead and stage. Is that core love? And about 250 meters per second with the prograde over the 80 mark. Close enough. Let's just slow our turn down a hair, let it catch up a little bit. Once once it hits about 300 meters per second, we will continue to turn a little faster again. Looks like we need to slow it down even more until it catches up speed. Try to keep it at the edge of our prograde, but we don't want to let it go outside of the prograde or we might lose control. Okay, so now that we're in the 300 meter per second range, it should be increasing speed faster. Let's keep ourselves centered with our prograde mark as it makes its way over to the 90-degree angle of the turn. And then once we reach that 90-degree angle, we will lock ourselves onto it and then switch over to the map view, making sure that our degree of inclination is at 90 and lock. Let's go to our map view and watch that apoapsis climb its way up to 70,000. Here shortly this should be switching to orbit mode as per usual. We're starting to get a little outside of that prograde mark. There we go. Okay, now we're safe to continue along on that 90-degree angle. Let's lock ourselves back there and stage. Re-highlight our apoapsis. Looks like it's almost at 70,000. It should be there very shortly. Once it hits about 69, 70, we will turn, go full sideways and lock ourselves there, making sure that we are at a 90-degree inclination. And we'll just let it finish its burn up to anywhere between where it is now and 100,000. By about then, it'll be time to stage to our wolfhound stage. Just make sure that we keep ourselves on the horizon. It will slowly move itself closer to the prograde, so we just need to make sure to slowly tap that over every now and then, relocking it. Once we hit about this altitude, we can go ahead and stage those fairings, get rid of those, lose a little bit of weight there, and regain some delta B. Let's see, our apoapsis is still slowly climbing. We are very close to leaving the atmosphere. Let's go ahead and get these solar panels highlighted and ready to deploy. We are now at 70,000. Let's deploy those solar panels. Go back to our map view, highlight our apoapsis, and zoom out. Recorrect our location on the nav ball. We will just wait for that to start its circularization, or wait for it to hit 100,000, whichever comes first. Looks like it's time to stage, so let's stage. Once again, we are just waiting for it to either begin to circularize or hit 100,000, whichever comes first. We need to keep an eye on these debris. Okay, looks like it's going to hit 100,000 and begin to poke the apoapsis out right about the time we hit 100,000 or so. Let's go ahead and stop. We will set ourselves to prograde. We will warp ahead until there's about 15 seconds or so left on the burn, or the timer, to the apoapsis. There we are. We'll just wait for it to reorient itself towards prograde now. And once it gets there, we'll wait for it to hit about, let's say, 10 seconds, and then we'll slowly increase our thruster and finish off our orbit. Just want to make sure that we're just pretty much stopping the apoapsis dead in its tracks a little bit. And then we will just throttle down slowly accordingly each time it looks like it's about to take off on us, until it's throttled down almost to the bottom and it's still moving forward like that. Then we'll just cut the engine and wait till we're right on top of the apoapsis, and then finish off our circularization like so. And there we go. Nice level orbit. Now we need to set Minmus as our target. And we are very close to that. Okay, we're not very close, but we're close enough to the descending node. We need to set ourselves to where we can raise that up, so we're going to normal, which is on the opposite side. Let's go that way. Once we're about halfway there, we'll turn our SAS back on, let it slow down a little bit, turn it back off, turn it back on, and then we'll move it to where we are right on line with that normal mark. Lock ourselves and warp on over to the descending node. Much like last time, we need to stop it a little ahead of it. That way we can burn it down to about -1 or down to about -0.5 or so. Just let that go ahead and do its thing, but where we cannot lock onto normal, where Jeb is not a level 2 pilot, we need to make sure to move this ourselves so we are right on top of that normal marker. Let's go ahead and increase the thrust just a little more so we don't fall ahead of the descending node. We want to make sure to stay behind it. And we're getting close. Once it's about here, we'll stop, realign ourselves with the normal mark, and wait until we are very close to being right on top of that descending node, and then we will re-engage our thrusters very slowly so it stops at dead in its tracks, slowing it down a little bit when it looks like it's about to take off. Let's cut the engine now. Make sure we are still lined up with the normal marker. Once we're right on top of it, we'll barely increase the thruster until it's about to wrap around, and we'll cut the engine. Now we should be perfectly aligned with Minmus. We just need to find out where it is now. Okay, much like last time, it is behind us. Let's go ahead and warp ahead, set ourselves a prograde. And we are now waiting for Minmus to once again come over the horizon at the opposite end of Kerbin. And once we get there, we will cut the time warp by hitting square or X if you're on the Xbox. Realign ourselves the prograde. We'll also realign our rotation to where the solar panels are on top and bottom. Let's close the warp menu so we can do that. Once we have our rotation, we will then time warp ahead just a little bit until the prograde and the target marks are beginning to touch. And once they start to cross each other's paths a little bit, we'll reorient ourselves and begin our burn. And it looks like we have a decent amount more delta V this time on the Wolfhound. That's good because we're going to need that extra delta V on to leave more for the top stage so we can make our landing as well as our rendezvous. We should definitely still have enough to be able to land and reorbit and redock with the other vessel and use it to return to Kerbin, even if it has to take the other command pod with it. It'll be kind of similar to all of our other rendezvous and docking missions where we're going to be landing the craft together. The command pods are a little bit larger, so it may be a little bit more dangerous returning both through the atmosphere of Kerbin this time, but we'll see. We'll have fun. It looks like the Mun should still be out of the way. Hopefully we won't have to deal with the Mun again. Trying to avoid that entirely this episode. Let's highlight our ascend node so we can keep an eye on it. Looks like it's like right where it needs to be because it keeps swapping to not available, which is pretty interesting. Alright, let's go ahead and refocus our view on Minmus again. Zoom in on that while keeping an eye on the apoapsis, making sure to stop before it reaches too far ahead of Minmus. We need to retro burn down because of that. And also, like last time, let's reduce the thrust limiter of the Wolfhound down nice and low. Re-highlight the periapsis so we can bring it in. This vessel's at a nice stable 45,000 meter orbit, so we'll try to get this periapsis as close to that as possible. Looks like we're going to have to reduce the thrust limiter down as low as possible to make that as accurate as possible. So let's go ahead and do that and stop that at about 46,000. That's good. And then we could go ahead and correct the degree of inclination on the trajectory, but we're going to wait until we get there to do that. So for now, let's go ahead and quick save. Set our time warp ahead just once. It did move it up to 49,000, but that's okay. we'll be okay once we get there. Let's go ahead and time warp over to Minmus. Just a little behind that periapsis so we can reorient ourselves and reset our thrust limiter back to maximum, much like last time. And now we wait. And we have entered the sphere of influence of Minmus. Let's go ahead and set that thrust limiter back to maximum. And we are going to have to stage before we actually do fully circularize our orbit burn. So we want to keep that in mind. Let's refocus on the vessel, zoom in. Once we get close to the periapse, maybe about 25 seconds behind it instead of 10 this time, since we are going to have to stage. Let's warp ahead. And let's prepare to start our burn, slowly increasing our thruster, or our throttle. And now let's stage, but let's cut our engines before we stage, and increase it just a little bit to get rid of that stage. Highlight our periapsis, and once it's down to about 10 seconds, we will finish our orbital burn. And 3, 2, 1, 0. Let's slowly throttle up until we freeze the periapsis in its place. There we go. And once we see that start to move forward, we will back off a little bit. And we'll wait until it's about 10 seconds away again. Let's highlight our apoapsis. And while we're at it, we need to make sure to set the M2A as our target so we can get that intersect and the target position highlighted and get them as close as possible. Once they are very close to each other, we will cut the engines, like so. Now we just need to wrap around and correct our ascending node, and in order to do that we are going to need to be pointing anti-normal, so let's go ahead and lock ourselves onto the anti-normal marker. And then we will time warp nice and close to that node. Alright. Looks like we have a little bit to burn there, so set our time warp ahead once and then warp over there to where we're just a little behind it. And once we get there, since we cannot lock onto anti-normal, again we need to make sure to manually make sure that we are right over top of that marker as we're burning. A little closer. And upon arrival, let's go ahead and realign ourselves to where we're nice and centered on that anti-normal mark and begin our burn very slowly until it's down to about negative or positive 1 or so. And then we'll time warp ahead again until we're close to it again. We're going to wait until we're pretty much right on top of it this time. Just make sure to keep ourselves centered on that anti-normal mark. We can go ahead and just time warp ahead. But as soon as we get there, we will start to slowly burn until that reaches 0. And let's check our separation. Okay, now we need to, I think, burn retro. Yep, because our orbit is still out too far compared to the vessel that we are trying to rendezvous with. Let's go to our engine and set its thrust limiter down as low as possible. Re-highlight this, and we will retro burn until we are as close as we can get on that separation. And it looks like 3.3 is going to be as close as we can get with that separation. We're going to have to do a little bit more burning to correct that. So let's prograde and bring that back to 3.3. And once it hits that 3.3 mark, we will cut the engine. And then, if I'm not mistaken, we're going to have to burn radial out, which is the teal target mark. with the marks pointing outward. Let's center ourselves there, lock it, and then begin to burn a little bit and see if that brings it in a little closer or not. Okay, it's 3.2. Let's see just how close we can get that now. We should be able to get it at least down below 1 kilometer, if I'm not mistaken, but we'll find out. Nope, it's not going to let us. Looks like 3 kilometers is as good as it's going to get. So let's go back to radial in so we can bring it down to 3 kilometers. Once it hits 3 kilometers, we will cut the engine and do a quick save. Now we can try one more thing to bring that in as close as possible, but for now let's set our time warp ahead once, and then we will time warp over to the descending node. And upon arrival, what we can try to do is burn retrograde and see if that'll bring that line in close enough. But we'll see. No, it's going in the opposite direction. Okay, so let's recorrect that by burning prograde and bringing it back down to 3.0. There is one other thing that we can do. Let's go back to our normal view and then align ourselves to where we are pointing directly at our target. Then we'll go to docking mode, activate our RCS, and we will force that prograde mark to be right over top of that target mark. And once we get it right over top of it, we will deactivate our RCS and then go back to our map view. It's a little bit closer. So for now, that's as good as it's going to get. Let's quick save and let's activate rotation control mode in our docking mode and then select retro. Make sure these engines are as low on the thrust limiter as we can get them, because we're only moving towards the target at about 5.1 meters per second. Once again, quick save just in case something happens. Go back to our map. Let's highlight that intersect node, warp ahead 1. We'll close that, and then we will warp until we have about a minute until our rendezvous. And upon arrival, we will swap back to our regular view. And then we will swap back to linear control mode on our docking mode. Actually, no, let's go back to rotation mode and then rotate the vessel to where it's right over top of the target. And like always, I need to stress that you do not have the RCS thrusters turned on while you're doing this, or it will mess up your orbital trajectory and the rendezvous itself. So let's point towards target. Okay, so our prograde marker is way too far away from the target marker, so the best thing that we can do right now, honestly, is set it to retro. And then once we are as close as possible, which will be about 2,800 meters away, which is about where we are now, we need to go back to linear mode and just use our RCS thrusters, conserving fuel, and begin to slow our vessel down relative to the target as close to 0 meters per second as possible. Once we hit that, we will cut the RCS off, go back to rotation mode, and point ourselves towards the target. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Cut the RCS, go back to rotation mode, and then point ourselves directly at the target. We will lock onto that position. And then go back to linear mode, turn the RCS back on, and begin to thrust with the RCS towards the target just a little bit, and then begin to move your prograde with the stick until it's right over top of it. And then once we have a nice line on that target with our prograde, we will turn the engines on a little bit, turn the RCS off, slowly increase our speed to about say, let's cut those engines and raise the thrust limiter up just a little bit, and then reactivate them until we get about 5 meters per second on our speed relative to the target, and then we will cut the engine. Let's go back to our map. So now we'll be about 800 meters away from the target. Let's save. And set our time warp ahead 1. Didn't mess with our separation at all. Very good. So let's go ahead and warp until we're about a minute away from Rendezvous. And once we get there, we need to make sure that we are pointing retro relative to the target. Let's go back to rotation mode. Now once that target crosses our path at about 800 meters or lower, we'll want it to be at about this point, around the center of the vessel as we're passing by it. And we'll slow ourselves back down to 0 meters per second relative to the target. We are about 47 seconds away from the time in which we will do that. We can go ahead and time warp just a little bit to save ourselves a little bit of time in the episode, since we are now over an hour. Gonna have to break this into 2 separate episodes, but we'll do both today. Alright, so now that it is close to being where it needs to be, at about halfway on our passing our vessel, we will cut the warp, reorient towards retro, and begin to burn down to 0 meters per second. Once it hits about 1 meter per second, we will cut the engines and do the rest with the RCS thrusters right about now. Let's go back to linear mode, and then we will turn our RCS on and finish slowing the vessel down with our RCS thrusters. As soon as it hits 0, we will turn our RCS thrusters off again. And then we will switch back to rotation mode by hitting X or A on the controller, or you can just do it with the mouse. Let's reorient ourselves towards the target. Once we are nice and lined up on that mark, we will lock our SAS and then go back to linear mode on the control, turn our RCS thrusters back on, begin to thrust towards the target while keeping the prograde line, or the prograde mark over top of the target mark. You can increase it to about maybe 1.5 meters per second or so. It won't take too much to slow that down. We've used about 1/3 of our monopropellant, so we want to make sure that we're not overdoing it. For now, let's just turn our RCS off, go back to rotation so we can make sure that we are still pointing directly at the target. We'll have to correct that and our prograde marker over top of the target marker a couple times along the way. Let's go ahead and time warp a little bit. We'll time warp until we're about 100 meters away from the target, or if we start to see our prograde move and deviate too far from the target mark, which it's slowly doing, we might have to stop at about 300 meters and correct that. So we'll wait until we hit about 300 meters. Let's go ahead and time warp a little faster. Once it hits about 300 meters again, we will cut our warp. We don't want that prograde marker to get too far from the target. Let's actually go ahead and stop now. Exit time warp mode, reactivate the RCS, and move that prograde back over on top of there. Deactivate the RCS. Let's quick save and re-enable time warp. We'll bring it down to about 100 meters. Maybe even more than that. Might have to stop at about 250 or 200 and correct our prograde mark again. Yeah, at about 200 we will cut the time warp again. And 2, 1, 0, stop the time warp. Exit time warp mode, re-enable RCS, and re-correct our prograde mark. Let's take it about here, and then deactivate our RCS, and we'll time warp ahead until we are at about, let's say 100 meters per second, or 100 meters away from the target. There we go. Alright, let's exit the time warp mode, reactivate our RCS, and Now we are going to have to prepare to slow the vessel down by using the left trigger as we are pointing towards the target. We are not right on target. Let's deactivate our RCS, go back to rotation mode, and turn the vessel to where it's pointing directly at the target. Lock ourselves, go back to linear mode, turn our RCS back on. Now we're just trying to make sure that that prograde is perfectly in line with the target marker as we move in 1 meter per second towards the target, which means we are going to be there in exactly 60 seconds now, but we're going to slow down and stop ourselves before we smash into the vessel. It's good that we have some sunlight so we can see what we're doing, since we don't have any lights on these vessels either. Now once we hit about maybe 25 meters, we're going to stop the vessel so we can reorient the vessels towards each other and make sure that we are controlling from the docking port and setting the docking ports as our targets on both vessels. Say at about 20 meters we will begin to slow down by using the left trigger. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and bring that down to 0 while keeping an eye on our prograde marker, correcting it as we slow down until we hit 0. Let's make sure not to get too close. Alright, let's turn our RCS off. And then we will set control from this docking port, and then we will highlight that docking port and set it as our target. And then holding the L1 or left shoulder button on the Xbox and hitting the D-pad either right or left, you can switch vessels. Do the same thing with this. Control from its docking port and then highlight the other docking port and set it as your target. Make sure that you are in rotation mode. And then rotate it until we are pointing at the target vessel and its docking port, which will be over here. Then we want to rotate to where these solar panels are pointing up and down, switch back to the other vessel, make sure those are pointing left and right. That way those solar panels do not make contact. Now we just need to make sure to correct the target mark on both vessels. Do it a couple times until they are as close as possible. And we haven't used the monopropellant on this vessel at all, so we'll start to use it. Let's go back to linear mode, turn our RCS back on, and we can set our view and aim our camera at that docking port so we can get a nicer view of this. Let's begin to move towards this docking port. Looks like we are perfectly in line, so we'll move in a little bit quickly and we'll slow it down once we get nice and close. We don't want to be moving in any faster than we already are right now, but it's preferred that we move in at about 0.1 meter per second. Let's make sure that that's nice and lined up still. Once we get close, turn off our RCS, turn off our SAS. Now we are docked. And then here in a few seconds, all of those have highlighted. We have successfully completed the build a new orbital station around Minmus, so that's done. And if you look up here, say we completed that contract, and we have also performed a rendezvous maneuver and a docking maneuver around Minmus. So let's get rid of that. And this is the vessel that we're going to be taking to the surface of Minmus, so let's highlight the crew hatch over here, and then transfer Bob into this one. And now we have finished all that we can do in the space around Minmus by transferring crew between vessels. This is the science vessel. It's going to be chock full of all the science that we're going to be returning, and as such we need to go ahead and collect a crew report. Actually no, instead of that let's EVA our scientist, which is Bob, and see what kind of EVA report we can get from the space near Minmus. See if we can get a new one that we don't have yet. Looks like we are just high over Minmus. Okay, so we'll just take that. Even though we're not going to get any science for that, we can still complete the contract, which is the science data from the space around Minmus. Now, other than that, there is nothing else we can do in the space around Minmus, so let's close that menu and make sure that we are ready to land. Let's go ahead and quick save. Let's highlight both these fuel tanks, and then highlight this smaller tank over on this side and dump some of the fuel out of it to fill these tanks back up so we have as much fuel as possible to make this landing. Once those are full, we can close those. Now, to do what I just did, you just have to hold the L1 or left shoulder button and then hit square on the PlayStation or X on the Xbox. And while holding that shoulder button, you can do that to select as many, or, okay, wrong one. You have to hit R1 or the right shoulder button and then hit square or X. And you can highlight as many parts as you want and have them open together at the same time. But what we just did, we highlighted these two tanks to move the fuel into, and then one tank at a time to dump out into those tanks. You can also do it in over here to take fuel from both of these evenly into that tank. Let's go ahead and stop those and dump that back out into those tanks since we're going to be landing with that vessel. And once we're done doing that, we need to highlight the engine here, set our thrust limiter back to max. Do the same for this one. Let's go ahead and save our progress. And we are not going to be using this engine anytime soon. Let's go ahead and cut it off just in case anything happens. Now we are prepared to land on Minmus, which we will do in the next episode, which I will resume and pick back up here shortly after a quick break. But for now, thank you for watching how to make a rendezvous, dock, and transfer between vessels around Minmus, and I will see you all again here shortly. Goodbye.